We're getting ready to celebrate the grand opening of Longfellow Park. This project really illustrates what can happen when you collaborate. We've got AARP, CPEX, BREC, the city, DPW, all at the table trying to make this whole entire area a better place.
Good morning. I'm Paul Rainwater with Cornerstone Government Affairs and a member of the Center for Planning Excellence. I want to welcome you to the second day of the Center for Planning Excellence Smart Growth Summit. It's a critical time for all of us to come together and to have this important conversation necessary to move our state forward. And I'm proud to be part of the leadership of an organization that is working to tackle the most difficult issues facing our state and doing it in a way that is focused on solutions, bringing people together and building community and partnerships with residents and local leaders. Yesterday, we heard from CPEX President and CEO Camille Manning-Broome, and you heard from Governor Edwards, who I am personally very proud of and some of his comments that he has made. Although the governor and I aren't of the same political party, we worked together a lot during the Jindal administration. He was in the opposition, and I was part of the administration that he opposed a lot of, right, and a lot of our policies. But we came together and worked on issues together that were important to the state. And the governor and I have worked very closely on issues that we believe that will help move our state forward. And so I read the other day where the governor talked about it was important that we use science, which I haven't heard a governor say that in quite some time, to be very frank. And I was very proud of the fact that we need to come up with science-based solutions, and he recognizes that. And to move our state forward and to protect it the way that it needs to be protected, we need to come up with science-based solutions that funnel money in the right places so that we're not wasting scarce resources. But you heard him talk about the challenges Louisiana is facing, the slow-moving disasters like land loss and chronic poverty, increasing frequencies and intensity of acute disasters such as floods, droughts, and hurricanes. Risk is growing for everyone. Resources are limited and disparities are widening. Markets and insurers are responding to these changes, and we must do the same and even do more. We can't forever be in response mode if we want to get ahead. Building resilience means that taking a proactive approach and staying ahead of the curve is the only option we have. We also heard from Camille and Governor Edwards and the stellar lineup of speakers yesterday about solutions that are already available, solutions that we need to create, and the transformations we must use to drive if we are to become a future-ready state. A state that offers hope, opportunity, security, and rich experience to its residents, its visitors, and its investors. Rather than becoming mired in the threats and losses, let's focus on actions that create the future we want to live in. What does it take to look like? What does that take as far as dollars and expenditures? And whether we're talking with Joyce Coffey about closing the resilience gap in Louisiana, or with development gurus like Quint Stutter or Tommy Pacello about doing development differently. The future requires that we do things differently. We can no longer do the same things if we're going to survive as a state. For many years, I've had conversations with developers in Louisiana and economic experts about how we compete. And it's almost comical sometimes. I feel like we're looking at ourselves in the mirror where we're having debates about competing with Texas, when places like Houston, Texas have the GDP of Saudi Arabia. It's a ridiculous conversation. And unless we begin to look at things differently and we look at ourselves differently, we are not going to be able to compete with Texas, or Florida, or Michigan, or California. It is a ridiculous conversation to have. So big changes that are difficult and can be costly and personally and politically uncomfortable, but they're important for our future. We have to make those changes. And we have to make big changes that disrupt the status quo and bring about systematic transformations. Changes that will require all of us to step up, to set differences aside and work together. Changes that call for courageous, mission-driven leadership. Changes that we must make if we want a new Louisiana to become a reality. And the fact is that unless we make those changes in education and healthcare and the way we do land use planning, we have a receding coastline that is real. We have to recognize that climate change is occurring. Now, whether or not you agree it's occurring because of carbon emissions or changes in the environment. Doesn't really matter. It's happening. And Louisiana is actually a leader in this conversation, which is, very heartening to me that we're having this conversation. But we have to invest in infrastructure, and we have to convince the public that austerity is not a policy that leads to progress. We've got to win the trust of the public to help them understand that if we're going to move forward as a state, that we have to raise gas taxes to pay for an additional bridge or additional roads. That in our local communities, that it's important that we continue to be progressive, and we look at as we look at fire protection and police protection and how we do those things. And that planning departments are important. Floodplain management is important. Those are things that aren't meant to control people, but to help people survive in this ever-changing environment. And it means that we have to have tough conversations amongst ourselves as policymakers and leaders, that we have to have the public's trust. And that means engaging. And it doesn't mean hiding behind a desk. It means going out and talking to people and having tough conversations, as I've experienced throughout my career, working in Calcasieu Parish and then working for the state of Louisiana after Katrina and Rita, Ike, and Gustav. It's not easy to go out and talk to the public about the things that need to happen in order to move it forward. But I've counted probably about 300 public hearings that I've participated in. And it means sitting at a table or a desk and at a public forum. And sometimes it means very uncomfortable conversations and interaction. But those are the things that we have to do if we want people to buy into the change that needs to happen. And it means that we need to rehumanize the public servant, because the public servant in government has been dehumanized by certain people and certain political parties. And we've got to figure a way to take that back. But it means that we have to engage in a conversation with the public and the people that pay our salaries. Not my salary anymore, because I'm in the private sector. But for many people and the experiences I've seen, it's a very difficult conversation to have. And if we want people to invest in infrastructure, invest in the vision that we have to move forward, it means that we have to engage. And it means we have to have conversations about race, sexual orientation. We have to get all that off the table so that we can focus on the things that are important. But it means we have to solve those issues. It means we have to look at each other like humans and not like political parties. I am sick of hearing the conversations about Democrat versus Republican when our country is falling apart at the seams. I spent 100 days in the city of New Orleans last year working on issues around the Sewage and Water Board and trying to fix, there were quite a few really funny cartoons that were put out about it. But it's a serious issue. But if you look at how services are provided and racial disparity and socioeconomic issues, it all plays a role. And we have to deal with those issues if we're going to move forward. And if you look at it from the perspective of the state of Louisiana and the money that we've invested in New Orleans, the reality is we've got to solve those problems around water management and around how we invest in what we do. So today at the Smart Growth Summit, we will continue the conversation about change in action for a future-ready Louisiana. From the legacy of racial division to new approaches to watershed management and resilient infrastructure development. We'll focus on solutions and opportunities that move us from a state of perpetual recovery to a resilient state, setting standards for the future nationally and globally. And it is possible for us to do that. Thank you for being here to help drive these changes for greater good. The future of our state literally depends on what you do here and the conversations you have outside this room later on in your careers as you go forward into the places you work. So now I'm going to be followed by Chris Tyson, and hope you guys have a great morning and a great day. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Paul. Good morning. I am so excited for the session that we are about to have this morning. I can say that I personally pushed for it and couldn't be more thrilled to greet you this morning on behalf of the presentation that we are about to have. I have, both in my role as a law professor and in previous positions, been always fascinated about the stories that we tell ourselves about the way or why the way things are, how we understand our collective shared history, how we interpret what we see in our communities, and how we understand the roots and the genesis of those challenges and struggles that we work in the current space to address. And in the research that I've done as a scholar, in the writing that I've done, I have greatly enjoyed the work of Richard Rothstein, who has spent many years and many articles detailing the intricate history of racial segregation, and particularly the policy underpinnings, the legal and policy underpinnings of that multi-decade, almost century process of how we both developed the American landscape and American housing markets and American neighborhoods, but done so in a very deliberately segregated fashion that we don't always recognize the consequences of when we look at the challenges we face in the cities today. Indeed, it is possible to go through many urban neighborhoods and deduce that what you are seeing is simply the cumulative result of poor choice making, weak values, and laziness, and not something that is much more deeply embedded in the policy and legal and social and cultural fabric of our nation. Something that has been accomplished through massive amounts of subsidization, through every arm of government, state, local, and federal, and through all legal rationalizations that one can think about. When you are greeted with this history, when you really sit with it, it is astounding. For many of us, it fundamentally alters our understanding of the communities in which we live, the nation in which we live, and the challenges that we face. Indeed, earlier this year in January at the LSU Law Center, I hosted a book club around the color of law. We met for 3 weeks, 3 Fridays, and we had about 100 or so attendees. It was a fascinating discussion. But the liveliness of that discussion got less and less. And by the last session, I looked out into a crowd of shell-shocked people. And not just white people, black people, not just old, young people. Everyone was shell-shocked. And they said, I didn't understand the dimensions of this. I didn't understand the depths of this. How did this occur in my lifetime and I not know about it? So that is why I'm so excited to have Richard Rothstein, who has been for the last year and a half traveling the country, greeting audiences just like this, sharing this history, as many in the nation have embraced the color of law and been awakened to this untold chapter in American history. This morning, you're going to hear from Richard Rothstein himself, who's going to talk about his research, his work in the color of law, and that is going to set the stage for a great discussion we're going to have with some familiar and noted people who I will introduce after Mr. Rothstein's speech. I want to mention also that this program is sponsored by the Foundation for Louisiana, the Pew Institute at the LSU Law Center, and Metromorphosis Incorporated, along with the East Baton Rouge Redevelopment Authority. A brief introduction, and after this introduction, the next voice you hear will be that of Richard Rothstein. Richard Rothstein, Research Associate of the Economic Policy Institute and a Fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, is also a fellow at the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley, and he is a Berkeley resident. Rothstein is the author of The Color of Law, a book that expands upon and provides a national perspective on his recent work that has documented the history of state-sponsored residential segregation, which was sparked by his report, The Making of Ferguson. He is the author of Grading Education, Getting Accountability Right, Class in Schools, Using Social, Economic, and Educational Reform to Close the Black-White Achievement Gap. He is also the author of The Way We Were, Myths and Realities of America's Student Achievement. Other recent works include The Charter School Dust-Up, Examining the Evidence on Enrollment and Achievement, and All Else Equal, Are Public and Private Schools Different? You will hear from Mr. Rothstein here, and afterwards we will also greet him in a book signing event. Without any further ado, Richard Rothstein.
Thank you very much, Chris. And thanks to all of you for coming here today. You know, one of the things that happens to us old retired guys is we attract a lot of useless titles. And so you've just heard a few of them. As you all know, in the mid-20th century, we had a civil rights movement. I'm old enough to have been privileged to participate in it. It began in the 1930s with NAACP lawyers who challenged segregation in law schools because they figured that if judges couldn't understand anything else, maybe they could understand that you couldn't get a good legal education in a segregated law school. And then they used that precedent to abolish segregation in colleges and universities. That then led to a decision that you're all familiar with, the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 that abolished legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And that decision, the Brown decision, gave new impetus to a growing civil rights movement that engaged not only in litigation, not only in pressure for legislation, but in marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience. And that civil rights movement succeeded in abolishing segregation in water fountains and lunch counters and buses, public accommodations of all kinds. You're all familiar with these accomplishments. But yet, we left untouched the biggest segregation of all, and that is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were white or almost all white, and clearly defined areas that were black or almost all black. Racial boundaries are quite obvious and omnipresent everywhere in this country. How did the civil rights movement drop the ball, go home, having left untouched the biggest segregation of all? I think it's perhaps not all that hard to understand. It's harder to desegregate neighborhoods than to desegregate lunch counters and water fountains and buses. If we desegregate lunch counters and water fountains and buses, the next day you sit at any lunch counter, you sit anywhere you want on the bus, and the signs for separate water fountains come down. But if we desegregated neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. And so what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, whites, African Americans, conservatives, liberals, Republicans, Democrats, is we've adopted a national myth, a national rationalization that takes us off the hook from continuing the fight against segregation, even though we all knew in the 20th century that racial segregation was wrong, that it was harmful to both African Americans and to whites, that it was immoral, even that it was unconstitutional. We all accept, though, the fact that we have segregated neighborhoods. None of us like it, but we think it's part of the natural environment. We don't feel any responsibility to undo it. Well, the national myth that we adopted goes something like this. The other forms of racial segregation that we abolished in the 20th century, those were created by government. Those were the result of laws and regulations and policies adopted by government at all levels. They were unconstitutional. They violated the 5th and the 14th Amendments to the Constitution. And because they were a violation of civil rights, we had to abolish them. But this one, residential segregation, this one wasn't created by government. Residential segregation was created by private prejudice, by bigotry. White homeowners wouldn't sell homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or real estate agents wouldn't show homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or banks wouldn't make loans, and other private businesses wouldn't make loans to African Americans, either in black or in white neighborhoods. Or maybe it's just that people like to live with each other. You know, we like to self-segregate. We like to be with others just like ourselves. Or maybe it's just that, on average, African Americans don't have incomes that are as high as average white incomes, and therefore they mostly can't afford to live in white neighborhoods, middle-class neighborhoods. All of these things is what's created residential segregation, private activity. Government had not much to do with it, if anything. And because it was created by private activity, it's not a constitutional violation. It doesn't violate the 5th or the 14th Amendment. It's not a civil rights violation. It's just an unfortunate accident of social change and demography that we're facing. Well, I spent most of my career, I don't know if you listened to any of the titles that Chris just read of books I've written in the past. I didn't listen, so I don't, you didn't have to, but I spent most of my career studying education policy. And I came to understand that the biggest problem we face in education today was segregated schools, not legally segregated schools, but schools that were segregated because the neighborhoods in which they were located were segregated. I knew that when you concentrated children with the most serious economic and social disadvantages into single schools, it was impossible for those schools to achieve at the levels of schools where children didn't have those disadvantages. And I wrote many, many articles and books, as you heard, about this topic. I was the education columnist at the New York Times for a while and wrote weekly columns explaining why we had an achievement gap between average white children and average black children. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time this morning talking about it, but I'll give you just a couple of examples of the kinds of things I tried to explain. We know that African American children, urban children, typically have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class white children. They have asthma because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, in less well-maintained buildings. If they have asthma, they're up at night. They're drowsy when they come to school the next day. They're up at night wheezing. They may be sleepless when they come to school. They may be absent from school. Asthma is the largest single cause of chronic school absenteeism in this country today. And I tried to explain that if you do 2 groups of children who are equal in every respect, 2 identical groups of children, forget about race, forget about income, forget about everything else, 2 identical groups of children, but one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, so that group is coming to school less often and sleepless and more drowsy, that group is going to have lower average achievement than the group that comes to school well-rested and on a regular basis. It was a simple matter of logic. It's not that some children with asthma don't achieve at higher levels than typical children without, because there's a distribution of outcomes for every human characteristic, but on average, coming to school drowsy is going to make a difference. And I would write article after article about different social and economic characteristics that predict lower achievement for disadvantaged African American children, whether it's asthma or lead poisoning or stress from family economic insecurity or homelessness. There are dozens and dozens of these characteristics that predict lower achievement. And I thought to myself that, well, it's one thing if a child comes to school with one of these disadvantages, but what if you have a school where every child has either asthma or lead poisoning or stress or homelessness or insecurity, economic insecurity in the home? How can that school possibly achieve, on average for children, at the same level that a school can achieve if children all come to school not with lead poisoning, not with asthma, not with economic insecurity, and in stable homes? the achievement gap is easily understood if we think about the actual pathways by which it occurs. And yet we still had a national policy in those days, a lunatic national policy, if you ask me, which said that the only reason that we had an achievement gap was because teachers didn't have high enough expectations and we didn't test children enough. Well, this is what I was thinking about. I wasn't thinking about the problems I'm going to talk about this morning, but then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision about education, because that's what I was following at the time. It was a decision in which the Supreme Court looked at a desegregation plan that both the school districts of Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington had adopted. Very, very token desegregation plan. The leaders of those districts understood the issues I was just talking about. And they gave parents and children a choice of which school they would attend. But if the choice was going to make segregation worse, that choice would not be honored in favor of the choice of a child who would help to desegregate the school. So if you had a school that was almost all white or heavily white, and there was one place left, and both a black and a white child applied for that school, the black child would be given some preference. Very, very token, trivial plan. I mean, how many times do you have a case where there's one place left in the school and both a black and a white child apply for it? This was not going to accomplish significant desegregation, but it was a step in the right direction. The Supreme Court, though, was outraged. The decision was written by Chief Justice Roberts, and he explained that this plan was a violation of the Constitution to explicitly try to desegregate the schools. And the Chief Justice explained that the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. Well, I thought that was a pretty wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. That is indeed why the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. And then he went on to say that the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated, and the neighborhoods are segregated by accident because of all of the private decisions that I just described, because of bigoted real estate agents and banks and private homeowners and people liking to live with each other of the same race and income differences. He called this de facto segregation, a term that we're all familiar with. And he said, well, you have de facto segregation, it would be a violation of the Constitution for the government to try to undo it. It happened naturally. It can only unhappen naturally. Well, I read this decision, and I remembered learning about a case some years before in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the cities that this decision was involved with. And in that situation in Louisville, there was a white family in a single-family home in a suburb of Louisville called Shively, who had, and the Shively suburb was all white. And this homeowner had a friend who was an African-American living in the center city of Louisville in the African-American neighborhood. And the friend was a decorated Navy veteran. He had a middle-class income, a good job, a wife, and a daughter. He wanted to move to a single-family suburban home, but nobody would sell him one. And so the white homeowner bought a second home in the suburb of Shively and resold it to his African-American friend. In those days, that was the only way that African-Americans ever were able to move into suburban communities, was if a white friend or civil rights advocate bought a home and resold it to him. Well, in this case, when the African-American family moved into their home, a mob surrounded the home. They were protected by the police. The mob threw rocks through the windows. Even with the police protection, they couldn't identify a single perpetrator. And then they dynamited and firebombed the home. And they still couldn't identify. The police claimed they couldn't identify a perpetrator. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home to an African-American. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound much to me like de facto segregation. If the entire legal system, entire criminal justice system is being mobilized to enforce racial boundaries in Louisville, Kentucky, this seems like a very much a government involved. And so I began to look into whether this was just an isolated incident or whether there was a systematic pattern of government participation in the enforcement of racial boundaries in metropolitan areas in this country. And the result is, as you heard from Chris, is a book called The Color of Law, in which I document that de facto segregation is an utter myth. It's a myth we all hold. There's no basis in reality to it whatsoever. It was not only this individual incident, there were actually thousands of incidents of violence, state-supported violence, police, courts, the judicial system, enforcing racial boundaries, as in that Louisville situation, and there were many, many other policies that the federal, state, and local governments followed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in metropolitan areas in this country. The consequence of this is that if I'm correct, and I'll tell you now I know I'm correct because, as Chris mentioned, the book has been out for a year and a half and not a single fact that I've documented has been challenged. If I'm correct, then residential segregation is as unconstitutional as the segregation of the many more trivial things that we addressed in the 20th century. It's much a civil rights violation as the segregation of water fountains or buses or lunch counters or even schools and colleges. And if it is unconstitutional, if it is a civil rights violation, then all of us as American citizens have an obligation to remedy it, to undo it, to remedy it. Not something that's optional on our part. If there's a civil rights violation amongst us, we as American citizens have an obligation to do something about it. It's not the job just of the courts. It's not the job of Congress. It's not the job of the president or of local government. It's our job. So I want to describe to you in a few minutes this morning what some of the major policies that the federal government pursued in order to ensure residential segregation. I'm not going to be able to describe very many of them, and there were local and state policies as well, but I'm going to focus just on two that the federal government pursued, just to give you a flavor of how systematic this unconstitutional system of racial boundaries is. The first policy I want to describe to you is public housing. Now, I know you all think you know what public housing is, as I did. You all think that public housing is a place where poor people live. Lots of single mothers with children, lots of young men without access to jobs in the formal economy. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country in the New Deal in the 1930s during the Depression, in the Roosevelt administration, and poor people were not permitted into public housing. Public housing was designed for working class families with stable employment and a good employment history. There was the Depression, where the 25% unemployment rate, but public housing was for the 75% who were employed, but for whom there was no housing because no housing was being built in the Depression. There was a housing shortage. So the government built the first civilian housing in this country for working class families, almost only for white families, but some for African Americans as well, but always segregated, creating separate projects for African Americans and for whites, frequently segregating neighborhoods that had previously been integrated. Now, that may surprise you as well, but in the mid-early 20th century, we had many, many urban integrated neighborhoods for the simple reason that jobs were all located either in factories or in warehouses or in other workplaces near either a railroad terminal or a deep water port, because that's how industry got its parts and shipped its final products. So if you had an employment area, a factory area that employed immigrant workers of all kinds, Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants, Jewish immigrants, African Americans, rural migrants, they all had to live in roughly the same area. They didn't have automobiles to get to work. They had to be able to get to their jobs, and so they lived in the same broad areas, much more integration in urban areas then than there is today. We would be stunned if we were transported back to that time to see the extent to which there was integration. We weren't a fully integrated society, but there were many integrated neighborhoods for the reasons that I described. The Public Works Administration demolished housing in many of these neighborhoods to create segregated patterns that still persist to this day. In my book, I refer to the great African-American poet, novelist, playwright, you're all familiar with him, Langston Hughes. Hughes describes how he grew up. In his autobiography, he describes how he grew up in an integrated Cleveland neighborhood, Cleveland, Ohio, downtown Cleveland. He said in high school his best friend was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl in high school. This was early 20th century America. The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood of Cleveland and demolished housing to build two separate projects, one for whites and one for African Americans. It built other equally segregated projects elsewhere in Cleveland, creating a pattern of segregation in Cleveland that set a pattern for the future growth of that metropolis. And it did the same thing everywhere in the country that it touched. In my book, I like to focus on self-satisfied places, places that think they're better than you are. Cambridge, Massachusetts, for example. You've heard of that? Yeah. The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood in Cambridge, was an integrated neighborhood in the 1930s. It was actually about half black and half white. It was not a place where people didn't get along. It was an integrated neighborhood, a functioning integrated neighborhood. But the Public Works Administration demolished housing there to build two separate projects, one for whites and one for African Americans, creating for the first time in that area a segregated pattern. And with that and other projects elsewhere in the Boston area, equally segregated, created a pattern of segregation that still exists to this day. During World War II, the government's efforts to use government-constructed housing to create segregation accentuated. During World War II, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of defense production to take jobs in war industries, jobs that had been scarce during the Depression. Both African Americans and whites came to take these jobs. They overwhelmed the communities where the war production was going on. The communities couldn't absorb all these workers. The production was ramping up so rapidly the United States entered World War II in a very rapid way and was late in getting prepared, so the factories were operating and hiring daily. The only way the government could get the ships and the tanks and the jeeps and the aircraft produced was by building housing for the workers who were coming to these centers of war production, and it did. And everywhere, the government built segregated housing for war workers, even though they were working in the same plants. The workforces were integrated, but the housing was always segregated. For example, you heard before that I now live in Berkeley, another one of those self-satisfied places. And Berkeley had a suburb called Richmond, which was the largest center of shipbuilding on the West Coast. It was a tiny community, 20,000 whites. There were very few African Americans living on the West Coast prior to World War II. The great migration of African Americans out of the South, out of places like this, didn't affect the West Coast until World War II. The only African Americans living on the West Coast were people who came to California during the gold rush, or there was an integrated community in Oakland, California, because the Pullman car company would only hire African Americans as Pullman car porters, and that was the terminus of the Intercontinental Railroad, so that was an integrated community. But aside from that, there were very few African Americans on the West Coast. Well, by the end of World War II, there were 100,000 workers in the shipyards of Richmond, this suburb of Berkeley. The government built housing for them. It built shoddy temporary housing for the African Americans along the railroad tracks and in the industrial areas of Berkeley and Richmond. It was temporary because the city of Richmond announced that any African Americans who came to Richmond during the war would have to leave at the end of the war. And it built permanent housing for the white workers in the white residential areas of Richmond and Berkeley, creating a pattern of segregation there. And here we can say on the West Coast that otherwise would never have existed. You might say that in Cleveland, the government was building on prior informal segregation. Not on the West Coast. There weren't any African Americans to speak of to segregate. The segregation that we now know in Portland and in Seattle and in the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles was all created by the federal government during World War II, when the first large numbers of African Americans came to those communities. After World War II, there was still an enormous housing shortage. President Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt, had to deal with the shortage. Millions of returning war veterans were coming home needing housing. He proposed a vast expansion of the nation's public housing program. And remember, we're not talking about housing for poor people. These are returning war veterans who had jobs in the post-war economy, just like the previous war workers in World War II, or the workers in the middle-class workers in the 1930s and the Depression. All of these people were paying the full cost of the housing and their rent. This wasn't a subsidized program. But Truman proposed a vast expansion of this public housing program for the returning war veterans. Conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat Truman's expansion of public housing. They wanted to defeat it not because they were opposed to helping poor people. There were no poor people living in public housing to speak of at that time. And not for racial reasons, because it was always segregated. They didn't object to that. They wanted to defeat it simply because, they thought that public housing was socialistic and we shouldn't be building public housing at all. Returning war veterans were living in open fields and in Quonset huts and doubled up with families, tripled up with families. We actually had a national mother-in-law crisis at the time that Truman had to address, or else he would have been in big trouble. And so Truman wanted to expand this program of public housing. Conservatives wanted to defeat it. And the conservatives came up with a strategy which we refer to as a poison pill strategy. A poison pill strategy in Congress is one where opponents of a bill put forward an amendment which they think they can get a majority to pass. But when the amendment is passed and attached to the bill and the full bill comes up before Congress, that amendment makes the entire bill now unpalatable to a different majority and the bill goes down to defeat. That's a poison pill strategy. And conservatives in Congress proposed an amendment to the 1949 Housing Act that from now on, the amendment said, public housing has to be integrated. No more discrimination in public housing. No more segregation in public housing. It was, of course, a cynical move. They didn't want public housing at all, but they planned to vote for this amendment. They thought that Northern liberals would join them in voting for the amendment. That combination would create a majority to pass the amendment. But when the full bill came up before the floor of Congress with this integration amendment, the conservatives planned to flip and vote against the bill. They would be joined by Southern Democrats, who are all in favor of public housing if it was segregated, but not if it was integrated, and the bill would go down to defeat. So I want to tell you this story, and this is I think it's the most important story I'm going to tell you this morning, so I hope you'll pay attention to this and think about how it applies to the problems we face today. Liberals in Congress had to decide what to do. Were they going to support the integration amendment, guaranteeing that no housing would be built, or would they oppose the integration amendment and accept segregated housing, the continuation of segregated public housing? It was not an easy decision. I'm not trying to minimize how difficult this decision was. There was a national housing crisis. People were living in open fields and Quonset huts in slum conditions. We had a desperate housing need. Lots of homeless people, just like we have today. So liberals made the decision to oppose the integration amendment. They were led by a senator from Illinois whose name was Paul Douglas. He was the leading liberal in the Congress at that time. He was joined by Mr. Civil Rights, Hubert Humphrey, a name that you probably have heard, also a leading liberal in the Senate. And they both campaigned against the integration amendment. Senator Douglas got up on the floor of Congress and made a speech along the following lines. He said something like, "I want to say to my Negro friends that you'll be better off if the integration amendment is defeated and you get more housing than you will be if the integration amendment is passed and you'll get no housing at all." I'm not sure in retrospect that we have been better off, although I don't minimize the difficulty of the choice that they faced at that time, given the housing crisis. But they defeated the integration amendment. The full bill came up before Congress as a continued segregation program. The federal government used the vote on that bill against segregation as its justification for continuing to segregate all housing programs, not just public housing, for the next 15 years. And under this 1949 Housing Act that was passed as a segregated program, we vastly expanded the amount of public housing and reinforced and made virtually permanent the concentration of low-income families in urban areas through the public housing program. There were concentration of African American families in particular for another reason, and that is that very soon thereafter, as the public housing projects were built, and you're familiar with many of them, and many of the giant towers all over the country were built under the 1949 Housing Act. Perhaps the most famous is Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis. I don't know if you ever heard of that one. Some of you, maybe. Okay, yeah. Pruitt, there was two projects. Pruitt was for African Americans, Igoe was for whites. We now think of it as the Pruitt-Igoe projects. That's the way it was. But very soon thereafter, after these projects were built all over the country, a development occurred that was quite surprising. And that is that there were large numbers of vacancies in the white projects and long waiting lists for the black projects. The situation became so untenable that even the most segregationist public officials couldn't justify having two projects in the same city, or many projects in the same city, some of which had long waiting lists and the other which were virtually empty, that all the projects were soon opened up to African Americans, and soon they became almost entirely African American. And about the same time, industry left the cities. The industry that used to be located almost entirely near deep water ports and near railroad terminals was now moving out to rural areas and to suburbs because they no longer needed to get their parts and ship their final products by train or by ship. There were now highways being built, and they could ship their products by truck and get their parts by truck. So the people who were living in public housing, who were now almost overwhelmingly African American, no longer had access to good jobs. They became poorer and poorer. And public housing became the kind of public housing that we know today. They can no longer afford to pay the full cost of rent. The families living there, the government started to subsidize it. Once the government started to subsidize it, it stopped maintaining it. It stopped investing in it. The public projects deteriorated. They became the kind of urban slums that we're familiar with today. Why, you may ask, did the white projects all of a sudden develop all of these vacancies? These were returning war veterans who needed housing. They had jobs, but they needed housing. They were not that much different from the African Americans who were also living in public housing projects. Why did the white projects develop all these vacancies? And the reason was another federal program which was equally powerful in creating segregation. And that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration, a federal agency that was explicitly designed to suburbanize the entire white working class population into single-family homes in all-white suburban communities, like that suburb of Shively in Louisville that I described before. And these suburbs were created all over the country. You'll have to forgive me. As Chris told you, I've been traveling nonstop speaking about this history, and I can't know the names of the suburbs in every community I go to. So I can't name the suburbs in either New Orleans or Baton Rouge that you're familiar with, but you know what they are. These are working class suburbs that were created in the 1940s and 1950s that suburbanized the white population, the white working class population. The most famous of them you probably have heard of is Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes. Another that you may have heard of, some of you may recall hearing a song that Pete Seeger used to sing about the little boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all look the same. That was about a suburb that was just about as large as Levittown. It was south of San Francisco. And between San Francisco and New York, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these all-white developments were created on an explicitly racial basis by the federal government. A developer like Levitt, who built Levittown, could never have assembled the capital to build 17,000 homes in one place. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him money to build 17,000 homes in one place for which he had no buyers. And the same thing is true of all of the other suburban developers across the country. The only way they could build these suburbs was to go to the federal government, to the Federal Housing Administration, get the Federal Housing Administration to guarantee their bank loans, and the only way they could get that guarantee was by submitting their plans for the development, which included a commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The federal government even required Levitt and all of these other developers here in this area, they're still here, a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was a federal government requirement. It wasn't the action of rogue bureaucrats. It was written, set forth in the federal policy manual that the Federal Housing Administration issued and distributed to appraisers all over the country whose job it was to approve applications of developers to build these subdivisions. The manual said that you couldn't approve an application if it was for a development that would be integrated, that would not be racially exclusive. The manual even said you couldn't build a development that was all white if it was located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that ran the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. This is what the federal manual said. There's nothing de facto about this. It's an utter myth. This is the way the country was suburbanized. This is the way African Americans were concentrated in urban areas, while whites, working class families, were moved into single family homes in the suburbs. And the price that we paid for this choice that Senator Douglas made to create segregated projects, to perpetuate segregation, to ensure that the federal government would use that vote in Congress to continue to segregate all federal housing programs, the price has been enormous. The price of having residential segregation is almost inconceivable. I described before how it is the primary cause of the achievement gap in schools between African American and white children. Concentrating the most disadvantaged children in single schools where they overwhelm the ability of schools to focus on instruction. And it predicts the segregation that we created, our government created, all of our government created. The segregation that it created is a result of that vote that Congress took in 1949, predicts differences in health between African Americans and whites, lower life expectancies for African Americans, higher rates of heart disease, because African Americans live typically in less healthy neighborhoods, less healthy air, less access to fresh food, and less access to good medical care, more stress. It predicts certainly the kind of violence that we see the police committing against young African American men when we concentrate the most disadvantaged young men without hope and without access to jobs in the formal economy in single neighborhoods. And I think it also predicts the dangerous, frightening political polarization that we have in this country today, which, as you all know, partly tracks racial lines. It's hard for me to imagine how we can ever overcome that political polarization when African Americans and whites live so far from each other that they have no ability to identify with each other or understand each other's life experiences. How are we ever going to develop a national common identity that can overcome this political polarization so long as we maintain this racial segregation? So we made a devil's bargain. We agreed to create more housing so long as it was segregated. It was a government program, blatantly unconstitutional, and none of us have challenged it because we've adopted, as I say, this rationalization, this myth that it all happened by accident. How to undo this? Not hard to figure out. There are many, many policies that we can embrace to desegregate this country. Some of those policies include reinvesting in segregated low-income communities. But other policies include opening up non-low-income African communities, white middle-class communities, so that all Americans have the choice to live in them if they choose. And the policies, I say, are easy to think of. What's hard is developing the political will, the understanding about our obligation to embark upon these policies. Let me just describe a few policies that we could, let me see, yeah, I have a few more minutes. A few policies that we could embark upon if we had the will. And I'm not suggesting that these are politically realistic at this point. We have an enormous housing program today in this country. It costs the government billions of dollars. It's a subsidy, a continued subsidy for single-family homeowners. And most of these are in all white or mostly white segregated communities. The subsidy is called the mortgage interest deduction. It costs far more than anything we spend on low-income housing. And that subsidy perpetuates segregation by subsidizing all-white suburban communities. We could use that mortgage interest deduction as leverage to desegregate. We could, for example, withhold the mortgage interest deduction from homeowners in segregated neighborhoods that refuse to take steps to desegregate. For example, by repealing their zoning laws that prohibit the construction of townhouses or scattered apartments or even single-family homes on small lot sizes. It doesn't have to be a punitive program. We could put the withheld mortgage interest deductions in escrow and return them to those families when their communities took steps to desegregate. That would be an easy policy to administer. We're obviously nowhere near having the political will to do it. The suburbs that I described before, let me just, places like Levittown, all of these suburbs that were created, they were inexpensive suburbs at the time. They cost $100,000 apiece in today's inflation-adjusted money. That's, at the time, they were selling for $8,000, $9,000 apiece in the mid-20th century dollars. The white families who were subsidized in this way to move into these suburbs, $100,000, any working-class family, white or black, could have afforded to buy a home, especially returning war veterans who required no down payment. Those white families, over the next couple of generations, gained equity in those homes as the homes appreciated in value. Suburbs around this country now, homes sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. The white families who were subsidized in this way by this unconstitutional program were gained $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in equity. The result is that today African American incomes are about, on average, 60% of white incomes, 60%. That disparity is that's the subject of another lecture. I'm not going to give that now, but it's a 60% disparity. African American wealth is 10% of white wealth, and that enormous disparity is the result of unconstitutional federal housing policy practiced in the mid-20th century. We could very easily adopt a remedial program in which the federal government began to buy up homes as they became available. Nobody's be forced to sell homes in middle-class suburbs today for whatever they cost, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, and resell them to qualified African Americans for $100,000 that they would have paid had they been permitted to buy them a couple of generations ago. You know, that sounds radical. It's talked about. We talk about first-time home buyer programs. That would be a program that could remedy some of this. It's not politically feasible today, but it could be. At the low end, we have several programs that reinforce segregation, not because they're racially motivated, but because they're building on a segregated pattern and you don't need to have racially motivated programs anymore to reinforce it. The low-income housing tax credit program that I'm sure many of you are familiar with disproportionately places low-income housing in already low-income segregated neighborhoods. Landlords, developers would rather build low-income housing in already low-income neighborhoods. The land is cheaper there. They don't have to hold 100 community meetings explaining why they're bringing black and brown people into a white neighborhood. It's easy to rent those apartments because there are lots of low-income people around, and you can just put a sign in the window if you have a vacancy. We could very easily change that program so that we created an incentive for developers to place more of their low-income housing in high-opportunity communities where there was access to jobs and schools that were high-performing and grocery stores that sold fresh fruit and where the air was healthy. That would be a very easy fix to make in that program. We're not doing it. We're still placing almost all of those projects in low-income communities, reinforcing segregation. Same thing is true of the Section 8 program. The Section 8 voucher program reinforces segregation because most Section 8 vouchers, because of the way that program is designed, are usable only in low-income communities. The voucher amounts typically aren't high enough to rent in middle-class communities. Landlords are permitted to refuse to accept Section 8 voucher holders. They're not permitted to discriminate on any other basis except against Section 8 voucher holders. They have to say, we're not renting to you because you're black. They can say, we're not renting to you because we don't like where your rent is coming from. That could be changed. The Section 8 program is typically administered by public housing authorities whose jurisdiction doesn't extend beyond an urban area, and so they're not usable in suburban communities where they could provide families with greater opportunity. So, like I say, the programs to desegregate are not hard to think about. What is difficult is developing the political will to do it and to develop a new civil rights movement that's going to pick up where the last one left off and address the most serious form of segregation that we confront as a nation. As I said, the consequences of the choice we've made, we, the American people, have made to perpetuate segregation are enormous. We're paying a terrible price for it. The prices can only get worse, as we've been able to see in the last few years with the polarization that's existing. And unless we do something about it, unless we do form that new civil rights movement, we're going to be, I think, in very, very serious trouble. So I'm confident that all of you are going to join in that civil rights movement and take steps to remedy the situation. And I want to thank you very much for your attention.
All right. We are going to continue on with our panel discussion, and I'm going to ask the panelists to come and be seated on stage as I introduce them briefly, and you can read their full bios in the packets. We are joined by Jonathan Leit, Director of the New Orleans office at the Alembic Community Development. Jonathan is a real estate developer and urban planner focused on implementing neighborhood redevelopment projects in partnership with community-based organizations. Andreanecia, Executive Director of HousingNOLA. Andreanecia serves as the Executive Director, and HousingNOLA is the nonprofit responsible for New Orleans' 10-year housing strategy and implementation plan. And also, we're joined by Ashley Shelton, Executive Director of the Power Coalition. Ashley is also a CPEX board member. The Power Coalition uses a broad-based strategy that combines community organizing, issue advocacy, and civic action, all while increasing the capacity of community organizations throughout the state to sustain and hold the work. I'm going to join the panelists here on the stage, but please welcome our panelists. All right, well, this was, I think, I know you could have gone several more hours, and those who haven't had the privilege of reading the book, I hope that you will pick it up soon and be enlightened by this incredibly voluminous history that Richard has given us just a brief introduction to with his talks. I'd like for all of the panelists to maybe offer a few comments of introduction by just responding to both the subject of the talk, but also the book more broadly, and how it informs and impacts the work that you do every day. Andreanecia, we can start with you.
Good morning, everyone. So reading the book was incredibly enlightening. It was very helpful because, for a number of reasons, we've already kind of discovered some of these things. We knew a lot of these things. And again, putting it together in one place was remarkable, but it already drives a lot of our work with HousingNOLA. We dare to answer the question, how do you create the policies in order to undo a lot of these decisions? That's what HousingNOLA is. It's a policy strategy. And one of the challenges that Richard talks about and encapsulates what we're facing right now is finding the political will and employing it to actually implement these strategies. It's one thing, it's remarkable to learn and know these things. It's another set of challenges to come up with strategies that will actually change the problem or affect the right solution. And then it's another strategy on top of that to really implement them in a way that doesn't replicate the crisis in some other form or fashion. And that's what we're grappling with here in New Orleans as we work through the HousingNOLA plan.
Good morning, everyone. So I think I get to represent the developers here working in affordable housing and other things. So a couple places that I wanted to pick up on. One, I wanted to focus on the implications of a court ruling that I'm noting is on page 191 of the book, if anyone wants to go back and look at it. But it's had major implications for the affordable housing world. It's called the Inclusive Communities Project versus the state of Texas. And essentially what this ruled was, as Richard noted in his closing remarks, that the low-income housing tax credit program has predominantly, beyond predominantly, gone into high poverty areas and onto low poverty areas. And so the Supreme Court went all the way to U.S. Supreme Court, and it determined that there is a disparate impact on highly segregated and high poverty areas, and that this would violate the Fair Housing Act. Subsequent to that, there have been several lower court and other court cases or decisions that have given some mitigating factors. But what's important to get at is to understand how the low-income housing tax credit program works. It is a federal HUD program that is devolved to states. And every year, states create a policy document called the Qualified Allocation Plan that determines how they allocate this very scarce resource. What's important about this is that gives an opportunity, right? Is we talk about political will at your local level, but then there's political will at the state level. It reminds me, this ruling gets to, and I will admit that I'm a planner by training, and I went to that enclave that Richard noted up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and lived in Central Square, so can attest to his description of it. But in planning speak, it gets to this idea of, do you invest scarce resources in people-based approaches or place-based approaches? And there are different tools for each. I was thinking back to my graduate studies and wanted to highlight a program that also gets at this court decision and all of the impacts that Richard noted. It was the Moving to Opportunity program. It was a HUD program in 1994. It was piloted in 5 cities, 3 East Coast, New York, Boston, Baltimore, and then Chicago and Los Angeles. The Moving to Opportunity program essentially took control groups and then experimental groups who were on the Section 8 vouchers and moved a certain number of families into high opportunity, low poverty areas and compared their outcomes to groups who stayed in high poverty areas. So I pulled out some of the outcomes. I wanted to just share them if that's okay. Interestingly, some of the early research was disappointing and contradicted what many people expected. 3 things in particular. Neighborhood poverty has no effect on adult earnings or employment. Neighborhood poverty has no consistent positive effects on the behavior of children or their academic performance. And number 3, neighborhood poverty improves some aspects of adult mental and physical health. this was not good. What was important about this is this initial research came about 5 years after the pilot program came. So fast forward to the later 2000s, and there was more long-term findings that were explored. And these really illuminated and manifested the results that we expected. This was from 2015 study. Increased future annual income by the mid-20s by roughly $3,500 or 31%. So children, their actual outcomes of earnings was increased by 31% for those groups, obviously, that moved to high opportunity areas. Increased marriage rates by 2 percentage points. Increased college attendance rates by 2.5 percentage points, as well as, importantly, the quality of college attended. And then lastly, an important note that what this research suggested is by moving people of color, low income to higher opportunity, lower segregated areas, that the age of the child and the time at which you moved was critical, right? That was, I think, the main takeaway. So moving to a lower poverty neighborhood in the teenage years did not have a significant impact on educational outcomes or earning potential. And that makes sense, right? But the earlier the intervention, the more effective it became. So just, I guess, in closing initial thoughts, that there are different tools for different things. And Richard notes 2 of them: inclusionary zoning, Section 8. These are very effective. I'd add another one, actually, land trusts, community land trusts, around creating opportunities in low poverty, high opportunity areas. I would disagree a little bit on the low-income housing tax credit program with the court ruling and some of the notes in the book. While, yes, it is absolutely true that these have disproportionately gone to high poverty areas, and what that does is work against desegregation, at the same time, it is very, very difficult to bring investment to low-income areas without subsidy tools like the low-income housing tax credit program. And while there is certainly good and bad LIHTC development, when you create good LIHTC development, what that does is bring investment. And the opportunities to bring LIHTC investment to neighborhoods in our cities and in inner-ring suburbs that have close access to jobs, transportation, amenities like grocery stores and other things, when done right, can really be a powerful tool and does not have to really reinforce the segregation patterns. One last example, in this year's, in Louisiana Housing Corporation, which is our state housing finance agency, this year in our allocation document for LIHTC, there actually was an emphasis on doing projects in high opportunity areas. And I know that because we actually submitted one for a high opportunity area. We did not get funded, and I should note that no project in New Orleans or Baton Rouge was funded this year, so it's an opportunity to advocate with your legislators and with this finance agency. But this is actually starting to gain traction, and we see it in how funding is being allocated. It is a drop in the bucket, but there are these opportunities coming.
Good morning. I'm Ashley Shelton. I'm the Executive Director of the Power Coalition, and also a former employee of the Foundation for Louisiana, whose logo is up above, and had the opportunity to do a ton of work after Katrina, trying to specifically focus on housing and economic development. And then you find out very quickly that it doesn't matter how smart you are and how well you can write policy, that there is a lot of work and a lot of education that has to happen for people to understand and to implement policy solutions that work. And so much of what Richard lays out in this book, I think we lived with and through, and we tried to remedy with many different policy solutions. We helped do work around the Community Land Trust in New Orleans. We've done a lot of work to position nonprofit housing developers because we knew they were closer to people in community. We did, any number of different policy solutions to strengthen the voice of housing in the state, since we don't have a state housing agency. And so for me, I think that, I'm more about how do we connect people to policy solutions that and help people understand how these, how the legacy of these policy decisions by our government are still in play in their lives. And, and I think too, even in the work that we're currently doing in New Orleans with community, as folks are dealing with the frustration of being pushed out of, or the feeling that they're being pushed out of their neighborhoods and their communities, they can't afford to live there. We see the growing, gentrification. I think that what we've been trying to do is really think about, like, what are those solutions, what are those remedies, that really give people an opportunity to live the kind of lives they want to live in the communities that they were either raised in or that they want to live in. And so I think for me, this is just a great opportunity to kind of bridge what people understand and appreciate about how we got here, and then what is it going to take to actually implement policy solutions that make sense. Because I think, a lot of people were kind of shocked by what the book lays out around how the government actively and still actively participates in segregating this country. But I think that for me, I'm all about, like, let's move beyond the shock and really think about what are the policy solutions that are going to make people whole in our country and certainly in our state, and in particular people of color who have suffered many things: lack of economic opportunity, lack of the ability to own homes and do some of these things, that own the assets that allow them to grow and have have the kind of life and the kind of legacy that allows them to have wealth and generational wealth. And so for us, this is an opportunity to bridge, and we do a ton of work with Andreanecia in New Orleans and other housing nonprofits to really talk about, like, how do we build power. And so, I'll give a quick example. So we did some work around some nonpartisan civic engagement work around the mayor's race in Alexandria just this past election cycle. And for the first time, they just elected their first African-American mayor. They also have a brand new city council. And so there's some housing issues that community has lifted up time and time again that has been ignored, in particular from the voice and the perspective of the African-American members in that community. And so for me, we approach it from a perspective of power and education, right? And so through the opportunity of working with community to really think about the ways in which they could create and realize change, they now have the elected leadership that was very clear that was their agenda and the issues that they wanted to address. And now we're working diligently to put forth an agenda, to this new elected body to say, here's what the people asked for and how do we achieve it? So, I think for us, we're just trying to think of all the different ways that we can approach the problem. And some of it's power, some of it's people, and certainly at the end of that is policy change.
So this morning, the four of us, Jonathan was not able to join us, but he's going to fall right in with my next question, given his comments by way of introduction. This morning, we had a chance to have breakfast, and we could have invited you all over to the Hilton, and you could have just sat in the restaurant, and we could have continued our conversation. And so I want to do that here for the benefit of our audience. And this goes to in many ways to the point of what you talked about with inclusive communities, Jonathan, in that we have, I think, an emerging discussion around many policy solutions, but perhaps two thematic tracks that we are trying to reconcile that may seem in conflict or may seem difficult to reconcile or maybe not. And are worthy of discussion. And one is, should our focus be on concentrating resources in disinvested communities with the idea of raising the resource capacity of those neighborhoods, even though we know that it doesn't get to the broader issues of metropolitan segregation? Or is our focus more on addressing metropolitan segregation and looking at strategies that reshuffle the deck of location and demography in a way that allows people who have traditionally been structurally shut out of certain neighborhoods where opportunity is concentrated access to those places and spaces? And so, and there are, passionate views on both sides. Many people will say both and or either or. What say you? And I know a little bit because we had a great discussion about this morning, but I want you all to benefit. Talk to us about that. And Richard, I know that as you look forward to specific policy prescriptions in the next chapter of your work, you are also aware of this discourse.
Well, clearly we should need to do both. The problem is that almost everybody says we should do both. The reality is that what we do is give lip service to desegregation and put all our efforts on attempting to reinvest in disadvantaged communities. I do disagree with Jonathan about one point, and that is the history is that placing low-income housing tax credit developments in low-income neighborhoods has not resulted in the revitalization of those neighborhoods. There may be some exceptions, some neighborhoods that have improved as a result of the placement of those projects, but on the whole, this has not been a successful program for revitalizing those neighborhoods. They certainly provide better housing for the families who get the housing. These are new projects. They're better maintained. They replace housing that was dilapidated and not healthy. But they haven't attracted new investment in those neighborhoods. They haven't had an effect of revitalizing them. So we need to do both, but we also need to be serious about doing both. We need to embark on some of the policies that I described as well. And one of the problems, let me say, about putting low-income housing tax credit developments in higher opportunity neighborhoods is many of them are zoned to prohibit the construction of multi-unit dwellings in those neighborhoods. So we need to attack the zoning rules that prohibit the placement of those projects in places where people could benefit. Nobody should be forced to desegregate. Let me say that. Nobody should be, and nobody can be. There's no policy I can imagine that would force people. But the history is that when you create opportunities for people to move to more integrated communities, the waiting lists for those programs are long. So it's not that there's no demand for those programs, it's that we're not pursuing them.
And I think too, one quick thing that, in the book you talk about the long history of tax incentives and subsidies that have, kind of belied a lot of the segregation. But even when we have the opportunity to put forth policies like inclusionary zoning and put them into law and codify them, we've, come under attack at the state level to preempt that ability, in particular for the city of New Orleans. And, and successfully for the last 3 years, we've fought attempts, by different legislators to preempt New Orleans' ability to have inclusionary zoning. This most recent time, our governor said, the first 2 times we were able to kill the bill before it got to the governor's desk. This in 2018, the bill made it through the House, the Senate, and it made it to the governor's desk.
Ashley, can I interrupt you just a quick second? Because I think there are many people who aren't as informed about inclusionary zoning or, the legislative fight that has recently been underway in Louisiana. So if you could just give a little background for the benefit of those not as well informed, because this is an extremely important point that I fear hasn't left New Orleans enough throughout the state of Louisiana. So I really want to hear this.
Sure. I'll back up a little bit and say, it is true that New Orleans is probably one of the more progressive bastions in the state. And so, so after Katrina, there were a lot of different planning processes, the comprehensive zoning ordinance, which actually has been codified into law, right? That inclusionary zoning has to be a part of the blueprint for how New Orleans is revitalized and kind of comes back into its fullness following the storms. And what inclusionary zoning does is that basically in any kind of development, for-profit development or nonprofit developer developed properties, it forces some amount of affordable housing within those developments. And this is really important when you're talking about a community like New Orleans, mostly African American, huge service industry, also a very large artist industry or artistic, kind of industry. You need places for people to live. And Andreanecia and I have talked about it, ad nauseum about the fact that, we talk about how much we love New Orleans and how much we love to visit it, but the truth is that the people that make New Orleans what it is can no longer afford to live there. And, and so for us, protecting this idea that whatever developments come forward in the city of New Orleans, as it redevelops, that there has to be some type of, policy that says that you have to make sure that there's some affordability that's available to the people that live in that city. I think what is unfortunate, though, is that even though it is in the comprehensive zoning ordinance in the city of New Orleans, is that, we have not actually, though, been able to get, this is common sense. This is the, I don't want to say it's the lowest bar, but it's a low bar, right?
It's a low bar.
It's a low bar.
It's a low bar. And still, even at the city planning meeting as early as yesterday, they said, why are we rushing? Why are we rushing? And so I think that, for us, what is important to note about the statewide fight is that, we fought this fight for many years, but this most recent time, the governor really kind of laid out an edict, which was, I will veto this because of the outcry from mayors all over the state that said, do not preempt our ability to do this. But the reality is that if you guys don't codify this into policy in real ways, I won't veto it again. And so the clock is ticking for those of us that are advocates around housing policy and see inclusionary zoning as an opening for low-income individuals and communities around the state to be able to access any kind of affordability in developments that are coming up around the state, but in particular in cities like New Orleans and Baton Rouge that are growing, at a pretty extensive, clip. So.
Yeah.
Well, do you want to speak more on inclusionary zoning? Because I was going to go back to LIHTC.
You can go. I'm gonna go a different way.
Okay. Yeah, if I could, I'd like to get, because the reason to focus so much, I think, not only on inclusionary zoning, but a tool like low-income housing tax credit program is, for people who are not familiar with it, it is the reason that 90 to 95% of our affordable rental housing in the country is developed, right? It is the mechanism for doing affordable housing. And so it is such a huge opportunity. It pales in comparison to the mortgage interest deduction, but as far as tools that we already have and how to shape them to work better, it is the reason. So 2 things. I would suggest that it is certainly there are bad developers. We all know that there are bad developers. There are other kind of developers, especially as we progress into 2018 and what people are understanding that they're more cognizant of these things, more mindful. And so I'd say just like there's a huge difference between de facto and de jure segregation and is not by accident, it is not by accident that developers, many of them, are not developing in high opportunity areas. Richard touched on one of them, which is high land costs. Land is such an important thing because in low-income housing tax credit development, you cannot generate tax credits off of land. So when your dirt is really expensive, that is a very difficult project to finance versus when your construction costs are really high. There are some costs that you can mitigate when they're high. There are other costs you can't, and land is one that you can't. So there's actually a finance mechanism that works against it. Second, I would say, is that the folks in policy at these different housing finance agencies have instituted something nationally called cost containment. And cost containment, I would say, is another version of a racist policy, but it is saying that low-income housing tax credit housing should be good, but not that good, right? You shouldn't have all the amenities that everyone has. Why? Because this is taxpayer money and this is a scarce resource, so let's make it good enough. We don't want slum housing, right? But we don't want you to have too many bells and whistles because that's not a good use of taxpayer money.
And they might stay.
And they might stay. People might get comfortable there, right? So I would say that certainly there are developers who are not doing what they should be doing, but there are others who would actually like to be developing in those areas, but the policies and government has made it, and frankly real estate economics has made it very, very difficult to do so. And one other point about developing LIHTC in low-income areas, I would say, I agree. I mean, I've seen the research, and it definitely shows that it has not led to the kind of revitalization that we'd like to see. And that's because it is not a tool for revitalization. It is a tool for affordable housing. We use it, and there is a byproduct around revitalization, but that's not what it's designed for. However, I would say that we all know neighborhoods because we see them in our cities. I'm sure we see them in Baton Rouge. We know them really well in New Orleans, that the data shows that these are transitioning neighborhoods. They have proximity to high opportunity areas, and they're going to gentrify. And if we get in early enough to do LIHTC development, that is the opportunity where it will attract other investment and has the opportunity to be an anti-gentrification tool. So HousingNOLA, New Orleans Redevelopment Authority, to name 2, have done a great job of contracting for data, right? To identify neighborhoods that are close to in our city, to our urban core, where you can have amenities, but are communities of color and are low income historically. Those are the places, those are the neighborhoods that have the opportunity to revitalize and to attract additional investment in a more responsible and equitable way.
So my summation of all of this, or the way I want to kind of answer the question, Chris, is you do have to do both. Obviously, that's clear. But beyond, to Richard's point, the lip service paid around both issues, because I would argue we haven't gone deep enough on either, right? It's all kind of hand-waving and misdirection, and oh, look at this. And look what we did, right? Instead of real solutions. And that's, I think, where we're missing out on, and what we're trying to do with HousingNOLA is, what are we solving for? We're trying to solve for real equity. And somewhere along the way, I'm not sure how it happened, equity, people understood the term and embraced the term, and now they've dismissed the term. They've moved very quickly in the evolution. Resiliency has kind of been teetering in the same way, but it's getting a resurgence. But equity seems to be one that we're kind of looking back on and saying, yeah, that was a neat idea, but is it really what we want? And I would argue that it is. We are looking for equitable solutions. So when you start talking about neighborhoods that are majority people of color, that have seen historic disinvestments, and then talking about a neighboring community that is largely white or largely affluent, and which one do you choose? What's the more equitable solution? That's a hard conversation to have. We know because we've had them. In New Orleans, we have actually laid out and mapped all of our neighborhoods and talked about the ones that are the quote-unquote neighborhoods of opportunities, the low opportunity neighborhoods. We come back from an equity standpoint because we actually kind of reject that categorization, because in New Orleans, all of our neighborhoods are precious to somebody for some reason. And so, number one, you have to decide if you're going to be equitable, if you're going to give people the chance to thrive. This is all about people having a choice. And so if I want to stay in my neighborhood because my mama lives around the corner and she picks my kids up from school, and I should be able to get to my job from my neighborhood, or I should have a job in my neighborhood. And I should have a grocery store, and I should have resources. I shouldn't have to live in a food desert. I shouldn't have to live 30 minutes away by car from a job and an hour and a half by bus, and just settle for that. And that is what we're seeing in a lot of these communities. And again, the policies that we have suggested that we're trying to get implemented are designed to correct these inequities. And there's the resistance around that. One of the city planning commissioners yesterday said, with a straight face, because she voted across the board against any version, even voluntary inclusionary zoning, which is actually what she wanted, because she said with a straight face, well, it's telling people where they can live. With a straight face, she said, but it's telling people where they can live. No, boo, it's not you, boo. That boo. We're saying you're giving people the chance, the choice, the opportunity to live in this neighborhood where they actually work. And you're saying that you don't have to live somewhere else and be late for work three times out of the month. I mean, again, these are the real consequences of this. One of our transit partner did an analysis with our local casino. Y'all know we got a land-based casino in New Orleans, right? They talked about 70 of the workers who are transit dependent. In the month prior to the interview, about 50 of them were late 3 times because of transit. What's going to happen? Any of you are managers. What happens when your employee is that consistently late to work, even if they have a good reason? You may not fire them because they have a good reason, but you're not going to entrust them. They're not going to get a chance to prosper and to advance. This is how we continue to marginalize people and keep them down a lower level. This is how we tell them that it's because they're lazy and it's because they don't want to work really hard enough. It's not possible to work hard enough to overcome situations purely out of your control. So you say to someone, well, you should work hard enough and get another job, and you can buy a car, and then you can get to work on time. Those are kind of and again, so we've got to look at solutions that really, and policies that really aim at this. And this is why I enjoyed reading the book so much, because it was an affirmation of all of the things that we've been trying to do, and I learned things reading it, right? There were things that I didn't know, and I would beat everybody over the head in the City Planning Commission with this book if I could, to imprint it on them. So that, and again, we've got to talk about that with our policymakers, right? They've got to pick up documents like this and understand what the strategies are. And one point I will say, not to push back on you and Jonathan, Richard, about LIHTC, the issue with LIHTC, one of the things I have with it is making investments in those communities that are gentrifying, and then losing the affordable housing opportunities because the investment isn't long enough, the affordability requirement isn't long enough. What we have gotten really good at is incentivizing and concentrating wealth in or creating young developers and turning them into wealthy people, and then other developers who historically been doing it and making them wealthy again by giving them the opportunity to help bring this neighborhood on the come up. And then in 15 years, they're like, oh, well, neighborhoods change. We still need affordability there, but I'm not going to do it because my project that was subsidized by public funding is now worth exponentially more, and there is nothing compelling me. There's nothing forcing me. There's nothing mandating me that I operate in the service of the public good. So I think that, more than anything, is my biggest problem with how LIHTC has functioned across the country.
And I would say many states have implemented mandatory extended affordability periods. Louisiana has a voluntary one, but there you go. There's a great opportunity because other states have required it.
That's right.
Richard, you had a comment.
Well, I was just going to say that there are some states that have affordability requirements as long as 99 years. So it's not across the country that this is.
Choice.
We want to open up the discussion to you. We know you have many questions. Many of you have read the book and came to have an audience with Richard while he's with us before he jets off somewhere else. We have a microphone here, and if there are, and one here as well. And so if any of you have questions, we invite you to do so now. We have a few hands going up. We can continue talking, as you probably surmise. But we'd love to hear from
Richard.
you. Yes.
This is Joyce Coffey. I haven't read your book, and I think it's just remarkable what you're sharing with us. So thank you very, very much. My question to you is, can you share one example each of a federal program that you think is good, is helpful, is going to be something we should support, and two, what those of us who are not in the field should do? Like, what should we ask our congressperson, or what should we advocate for in city council?
Good question.
So could you repeat the?
Yeah, so the question after the complimentary comments about color of law, the question was, what should people who are not involved in these disciplines or this area, what should they be asking of decision makers and policy makers? What should they be advocating for? And she also asked, what are the programs you think are doing good work?
Well, I think, as I said, I don't think there's much chance. Well, I'm going to step back for a minute. Let me say that I think, as I did this research, I became hopeful. I thought this was a very hopeful history. I consider it hopeful because so long as we thought that this all happened by accident, it's easy to think it can only happen by accident. Once we understand that this all happened by very explicit policy, we can entertain the idea that it can be undone by policy. But I am not focused on trying to convince city council members or politicians of anything at this point because we need a political movement first. Political officials aren't going to listen to us at this point. So I talked a few minutes ago about all the policies we could follow, but I don't know enough about New Orleans or Baton Rouge, but I suspect that none of the councils in this community or in any community are about to enact those policies. What we need to do is create, when I say political will, I don't mean the will of politicians. I mean the will of the people that politicians are accountable to. And let me give you one example, and I do talk about this in the book. You know, in the course of writing doing this research, I caused myself to look at every textbook that's used in American history classes in high schools around this country. And every one of the textbooks lies about this history. I'm sorry. What do you want me to say? It misstates this history? Right. You know, it lies about the history.
That's right.
The most commonly used American history textbook in this country, I'm sure it's used in this area, is something called The Americans. It's got 1,200 pages in it. It's got one paragraph in it about discrimination in the North and one sentence in it about housing, and that sentence reads something like follows. In the North, African Americans found themselves forced into segregated housing. They found themselves. They woke up one morning, they looked out the window, and they said, hey, look at this, we're in segregated housing. Well, but this is a lie. This is a lie. Yes. And if we... And by the way, the textbooks go farther. They talk about the wonderful work that the Public Works Administration did in building housing during the Depression, never once mentioning that it was segregated. They talk about the great work that the Federal Housing Administration did to create single-family homes for working-class families, as though it were for all working-class families. Well, if the next generation doesn't learn this history any better than ours has, they're going to be in this poor position to remedy it as we've been. So my recommendation, and I'm sorry, this is not the answer you wanted. My recommendation is, instead of focusing on the city council people, I focus on our school board members and our principals and our superintendents and our teachers. Every one of us has children and grandchildren and nieces and nephews in the schools. We can do something about the way this is taught, so we can develop a new consensus to make it possible to influence city council people and legislators and other public officials.
Great. We have only a few more minutes. We want to take another question. We have one up here. Why don't we do this? Why don't we take 2 more questions? Cordell will take you, and then we have someone back here, and then we'll answer them together and close out. Okay.
Well, Richard, this has been a remarkable presentation. I thank you for the deep research you've done. I do want to generalize just a bit on the work that you've done. For those that don't know, I'm the chair of the board of CPEX, and I want to say that an overriding objective of CPEX, of which these summits are an important part, is to reveal to people why things are the way they are, because until you understand that, you don't really have an idea about how to approach changing them. So your focus on housing policy, I think, is a critical insight into something that I'll generalize on, which is to say that we have many other policies that are reinforcing these trends in the same way. And I'll just mention a couple. One of them is we have a cheap energy policy in this country. In this country, you can buy gasoline for $2.50 a gallon, and when you go outside this country, it's $8 a gallon. Well, what's the difference? Oil price is the same everywhere in the world. The difference is that in this country, we're subsidizing all of the other costs of transportation, and in other countries, they're collecting that tax to pay those costs so that the user is actually paying. This is encouraging us to sprawl out further and further, which exacerbates exactly the problem that we're talking about. Another is when we look at where almost all public investment takes place. We've observed that it mostly takes place on the ever-expanding edge, leaving disinvestment in the core. So these are other, and many of you will think of other policies. I like to say that things are the way they are for reasons, and those reasons are usually public policies, not necessarily designed to have the effects that they have. But until we understand that they are the reason things are the way they are, we can't question those policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Corda. Let's get this question, and then we'll allow the panel to close out.
Hi, I'm Keena Reed with Metamorphosis, and I'm curious to hear a response from Richard or any of our panelists. Richard mentioned the cost being so high because of these policies. One of the things that I was curious about is, how do you think our current housing crisis, the segregation, all of those policies may be connected to even maternity health when it comes to Black women? Because you mentioned a list of other things, and I was curious, do you think this speaks to our current crisis as Black women and maternity health as well?
Great. So with that, we'll answer the both comments and questions, and allow you all to, in doing so, make some closing statements.
Okay.
Thank you.
You want me to start? Okay. So the question was about connecting housing to the other issues, specifically about the health of Black women, the maternity health of Black women. And so, funny enough, Richard's going to think we stole all of this from him. We actually launched last year a campaign called Put Housing First that connects that says that housing is the foundation, that we need to make sure that everyone is secure and safely housed, equitably housed, right, in a neighborhood that allows them to thrive. And that is the foundation for addressing all of these other issues. If you are sick and you go to the hospital and you're released to a home that is moldy, mildewy, if you're a kid in one of the best schools in the country and you go home and your parents are fighting about paying the bills, if you are late to work 3 times a month, you will not be allowed to prosper and thrive. So getting housing settled first, we believe, is the foundation for that. It's also a political campaign. It's run by our partner, the the Greater New Orleans Housing Alliance, which is a 501c4, and that allows it to lobby and to really advocate. We are educating a voter base so that they understand how these issues are connected and they can make the right choices when they go to the voter booth to elect officials who will put housing first and select people who will put housing first. So I absolutely agree with you. It is absolutely connected. It makes it harder for communities to see all of these issues because we sometimes have things competing. That's why we have this really broad coalition that includes educators and healthcare professionals. Yesterday, at our City Planning Commission hearing in favor of mandatory inclusionary zoning, a physician came in and testified in favor of mandatory inclusionary zoning because he sees the impact on the people he treats every day. And so we're trying to build that broad-based coalition so people understand that it's not just what happens when you're in the hospital, it's what happens when you go home.
I would respond to the first question perhaps about what to do about it. I think what Richard said is spot on around changing education, certainly. I would say that we all, at the same time, we're all certainly realists about this, but also we're optimists, right? We wouldn't be doing this if we weren't also fundamentally optimists. One of the few good things perhaps about federal programs is that almost to a T, they require public input. So they require a meeting. Now, oftentimes, too often, it is a check the box, right? It is let people talk and then go away and never do anything about it. But what's happened is that the apathy around that, I mean, I don't show up to too many of those meetings, and they directly impact the programs that we use to finance we think are really good developments. We have to fight against that, and yes, it's the school boards but we have to keep bringing this book and beating city planning commissioners over the head, as Andreanecia said, with this. Otherwise, we have to do all of that. And so I would say get connected to your local advocates. I mean, HousingNOLA is an amazing one. New Orleans, we're so fortunate to have that. But these coalitions, and right, they have to be coalitions of whites, blacks, and everyone else. It cannot be monolithic, right? It has to be diverse. And we have to keep pushing. There are these public input requirements, and we have to keep trying at that.
Jonathan, I'm gonna ask Ashley to quickly offer some comments, and I want Richard to have the last comment. We have just a minute or so to close. That's the position I'm in, the moderator.
Sure,
so
I think you get the rambler to close. To talk quickly, rather. I think for me, all we do as an organization at the Power Coalition is engage citizens in the decision-making processes that govern their lives. Like that's our whole, that underlies our mission. And the idea is that, for too long we've allowed politicians we're in a position where we're begging them to do their jobs, right? And so for us, it's about how do we get in a proactive stance and really bring our issues to the forefront to those candidates when they're running for office, and then holding them accountable once they're in office. And so, for us, it's about how do we do that re-education? How do we give people back the power that they actually hold to govern their lives in the communities they live in? And so for us, we talked to over 700,000 voters in this last election on November 6th, and we're going to continue to do that work. And it's not just one touch, it's 7 touch programs where we're touching folks over and over and over again, saying, get involved. What matters to you, what's important to you. To Andreaneca's point on maternal health, I mean, we know that all of these issues start at home, and that, if we can give people a more solid foundation, no pun intended, that they can live better lives. And if we give them better opportunities and access to better homes, better housing triangulated with transit and job opportunities, the future's amazing.
Richard?
Well, Chris, I've had more opportunity to run my mouth than anybody else here, so I don't need to. I just want to wish you all good luck in pursuing the kinds of policies that we've talked about, and thank you for coming here today.
Thank you indeed. Everyone, this has been great. Please